I'm a biologist. More specifically than that, I am an ecologist. So I study species and ecosystems, how they respond to changes in the environment, and then how to manage for those changes to try to preserve biodiversity and the goods and services that people get from ecosystems. I had been working for a long time, like 15 years, on how climate change affects biodiversity, species, and ecosystems. And it was becoming increasingly unsatisfying because we were just saying all of the terrible things that could happen. Species and populations dying out or failing to get to new areas that they need to get to as the climate changes. And that part of our field seemed kind of well documented. But I was getting more and more interested in the so what? What are you going to do with that information? And that was kind of a controversial idea, but it was growing in popularity that you might actually do stuff to try to counteract the effects of climate change. And that we call climate change adaptation. In the NDIAS, they wanted you to take those tricky issues on to push your discipline forward, but also to push these questions of the normative pieces and come explore them there. There are things that we could do that would help preserve some of the biodiversity that is so important to humanity and that would reduce the human suffering that will come about from climate change through adaptation. And so while we're exploring all these negative consequences, we can be coming up with particular strategies that will reduce the effects of climate change. We often turn to butterflies as our study organism. Some of them play very critical roles as pollinators and food production. Some cycle nutrients, some of them are endangered, and so we're trying to figure out how to save them. They're our window into a broader range of issues and biodiversity questions. We've done quite a lot here at Notre Dame. We do a lot of field work. I also have developed an ongoing collaboration with scientists at the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, the National Park Service, and USGS. In the Indiana Dunes, there's a federally endangered butterfly that lives there. It's called the Karner blue butterfly. It lives in this really complicated mosaic of dairy and the steel mills. The dunes have been chopped up into these little pieces, mixed in with urbanization. And you think about how is this little endangered butterfly in these little patches of habitat, how is it going to make it through climate change? So we've had colonies of this endangered butterfly here alive at the University of Notre Dame. And when studying the Karner blue, we raise these issues. How do you conserve endangered species in this mixed land use when there's a systematic change like climate change happening? So we're talking about things like the possibility of moving Karner to new locations, something we call assisted migration or managed relocation, and how to manage the habitat in different ways to make it maybe more suitable in the future as the climate shifts. And unfortunately, the population at the Indiana Dunes seems to have gone extinct, and we think it may be the first federally endangered species to go extinct in a national park because of climate change. So there's an example of how one little creature can be a window into bigger issues. I do believe that if we understand well enough the consequences of warming for a species like the Karner blue, and we could find the way in which it is most sensitive to climate change, we could solve that problem. And so that won't save biodiversity everywhere, but it would have an impact on that species. And if we talk about how we went about doing that, then other people in other places could figure out their strategies. My project was this book project where I wanted to talk about what that meant. What did it mean to help ecosystems adapt to climate change? And so that has a bunch of science associated with it, like what methods would be effective, but also it had a lot of non-scientific questions associated with it, like how much would it cost, and who would do it, and is it allowed, and what if it goes bad? So it was a perfect project for NDIAS because it was scientific by nature, But it very quickly crosses over to our responsibility for the biosphere, how we're creating a problem and how in attempting to solve that problem we could create other problems and all those kinds of things. The solutions have these implementation pieces which are more than science. But I found that that's what I needed. So having been a fellow at NDIAS, those experiences make me a better scientist. They help me in the classroom. They help me be a better colleague. They help me interact with the world in a more effective way. And it makes the work that we do more relevant to society and more useful to the world. Universities must have these places where people can step away from their regular day-to-day lives and they can interact in an interdisciplinary way. The academy is so siloed. Even though we team teach and we write big multi-investigator grants, I don't talk very often to someone about how cultures identify themselves through nature. That happens in some other building. I don't know even where. So we must have these kinds of institutes, and we must have these kinds of institutes at Notre Dame. But what makes NDIAS different is that normative dimension. In my project, I don't say in the end, this is what we should do, but I say these are the things that we should use to make a decision about what we should do. So I think maybe that we could have those conversations elsewhere, but at Notre Dame, NDIAS, that part was really pushed, the should part. How do you decide what society could and should be? What are the values and the ethics and the science that you're using to reach your conclusion about what it should be? I think that is really distinctive for Notre Dame.